At 07:15, on the morning of February 3rd, 1944, a Japanese naval infantryman crouched inside a reinforced bunker on Kwajalein Island, listening to the thunder that had become his entire world. For 72 hours, American bombs and naval shells had been falling on his position. 15,000 tons of explosives had already struck the narrow coral island. The palm trees that once provided shade and concealment had been stripped to splintered stumps. The administrative buildings where Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama had established his headquarters lay in ruins. The radar installations that should have provided early warning of approaching aircraft were twisted metal. And yet the bunker held. Its walls of palm logs layered with coral sand and concrete had absorbed blast after blast. The design was proven. At Tarawa, 2 months earlier, similar fortifications had survived the American bombardment and extracted a terrible toll on the Marines who landed there. Over 1,000 Americans had died trying to cross those beaches. The Japanese defenders on Kwajalein believed their bunkers would perform just as well. They had no reason to think otherwise. What they did not know was that somewhere in the American invasion fleet, 5 vehicles were being prepared for landing that would render their carefully constructed defences obsolete in a matter of hours. The weapon was called the M10 Tank Destroyer, and it carried a gun originally designed to shoot down aircraft at 20,000 feet. On February 3rd, that gun would be pointed at palm log bunkers instead, and the Japanese would discover that the fortifications they trusted with their lives could be torn apart like paper. The Marshall Islands had been Japanese territory since the end of the First World War. Germany had controlled the islands before 1914, establishing trading posts and administrative outposts across the scattered atolls. When war erupted in Europe in August 1914, Japan saw an opportunity. As a nominal ally of Britain, Japan declared war on Germany on August 23, 1914, and quickly moved to seize German possessions throughout the Pacific. Japanese naval forces occupied the Marshall Islands by October of that year, facing virtually no resistance from the small German garrisons. The League of Nations formalized Japanese control in 1920, granting mandate authority over the former German territories. For over 2 decades, Japanese military planners had developed the Marshalls as a key component of their Pacific defensive perimeter. Kwajalein Atoll, the largest coral atoll on Earth, served as headquarters for the Imperial Japanese Navy's 6th Base Force and the primary administrative center for the entire island chain. The atoll comprised approximately 97 islands and islets, arranged in a roughly oval formation stretching 125 kilometers, enclosing one of the world's largest lagoons at over 2,000 square kilometers. The total land area was small, perhaps 16 square kilometers, but the strategic value was immense. From Kwajalein, Japanese aircraft could strike American positions throughout the Central Pacific. Japanese submarines could sortie against Allied shipping lanes. Japanese communications could coordinate defensive operations across thousands of miles of ocean. When American planners decided to breach the outer ring of the Japanese Empire, Kwajalein was an obvious target. The Japanese defensive doctrine in the Pacific had evolved through painful experience and careful engineering. By 1944, Imperial Japanese Army and Navy planners understood that they could not match American industrial production. The numbers were simply too overwhelming. American factories had produced over 47,000 aircraft in 1943 alone. American shipyards had launched over 2 million tons of merchant shipping in the same year. Japanese industry, constrained by limited resources and increasingly vulnerable supply lines, could not approach these figures. The Japanese could not build enough ships, enough aircraft, enough tanks to defeat the United States in a war of attrition. What they could do was make every island cost so much American blood that Washington would eventually negotiate a settlement rather than continue the slaughter. This strategy required fortifications that could survive the inevitable American bombardment and still be manned when the landing craft hit the beaches. Every day that a garrison held out was a day that delayed the American advance. Every American casualty was pressure on a democratic government that might eventually tire of the cost. The problem was the terrain itself. Coral atolls like Kwajalein presented unique engineering challenges that European military doctrine could not address. The water table on these islands sat only a few feet below the surface. The coral and sand that comprised the islands acted like a sponge, saturated with seawater that seeped through porous rock. Any excavation deeper than 3 or 4 feet would fill with brackish water within hours. Bomb craters became ponds, trenches became canals, underground magazines flooded, communication tunnels collapsed into muddy sinkholes. The Japanese could not dig the deep underground bunkers that European armies had perfected during the First World War, the elaborate trench systems that had protected German soldiers through years of artillery bombardment on the Western Front. They were forced to build up rather than down, creating fortifications that rose above the ground and relied on thickness rather than depth for protection. Japanese military engineers developed a standardized bunker design for coral atoll defense over several years of experimentation. The typical structure began with a framework of coconut palm logs, harvested from the dense groves that covered most Pacific islands. Palm wood possessed unique properties that made it ideal for fortification construction, properties that Japanese engineers had studied and documented in considerable detail. Unlike hardwoods that shattered under impact, palm logs were fibrous and flexible. The wood consisted of countless interlocking fibers rather than the uniform grain structure of temperate hardwoods. When struck by a projectile, these fibers absorbed kinetic energy rather than transmitting it through the material. A shell that would punch clean through an oak beam would become embedded in palm wood, its destructive force dissipated across thousands of individual fibers. The effect was similar to what modern engineers would recognize in Kevlar body armor, though the Japanese developed their palm log bunkers through practical experience rather than theoretical understanding of fiber dynamics. The engineers layered these logs in alternating directions, creating a lattice 3 to 4 feet thick. Horizontal logs were placed perpendicular to vertical logs, binding the structure together and preventing any single impact from compromising the entire wall. Between the log layers, they packed coral sand and rubble excavated from the surrounding reef. This mixture provided additional mass to absorb blast effects. The sand dissipated shock waves that penetrated the outer log layer, while the coral rubble added density without excessive weight. The outer surface was often coated with a layer of concrete where materials were available, typically 2 to 4 inches thick, though on remote atolls the concrete was sometimes replaced with additional sand and coral. The finished bunker presented walls that were 5 to 6 feet thick, with firing slits positioned to cover specific sectors of the beach. Interior space was cramped but functional, typically accommodating a light machine gun crew of 3 to 5 men with their weapon and ammunition. Larger bunkers could hold heavier weapons, including anti-tank guns and coastal defense artillery, though these required substantially more construction effort. The typical Japanese pillbox on Kwajalein measured approximately 12 feet square on the interior, with walls rising 6 feet from the floor to a reinforced roof. The roof construction was particularly important because it had to withstand both direct hits and the accumulation of debris from near misses. Engineers used the same layered approach as the walls, with palm logs covered by sand and coral topped with a concrete cap. The entire structure was then camouflaged to blend with the surrounding vegetation. Japanese troops were issued camouflage nets with green, brown, and tan strips woven through the mesh. Where time permitted, vegetation was deliberately planted on top of positions and around firing apertures. On palm-covered atolls, soldiers would place palm fronds around positions, creating concealment that would be indistinguishable from palm fronds knocked down by bombardment. American reconnaissance aircraft photographing Kwajalein before the invasion had difficulty distinguishing bunkers from natural debris until detailed analysis revealed the geometric patterns that betrayed artificial construction. These bunkers were not designed to survive direct hits from battleship guns. Nothing short of a deep underground shelter could accomplish that. A 16-inch shell from an American battleship weighed over 2,000 pounds and struck with enough force to penetrate dozens of feet of earth. No above-ground fortification could withstand such an impact. The bunkers were designed to survive the near misses that constituted the vast majority of bombardment effects. American naval gunners, firing from ranges of 10,000 yards or more, could not consistently place shells within 10 feet of a specific target. The dispersion of naval gunfire, caused by variations in propellant charges, barrel wear, atmospheric conditions, and the motion of the firing ship, meant that most rounds would land in the general area rather than on the precise target. These near misses would throw up tremendous quantities of sand and debris, shake the earth, and terrify the defenders. But the actual bunkers would remain intact unless struck directly. Even a shell landing 5 feet away might do nothing more than shift the structure slightly and shower its occupants with dirt. After the bombardment lifted, the Japanese defenders would emerge from their bunkers, man their weapons, and engage the American landing craft as they crossed the reef. This was the doctrine that had worked at Tarawa. On November 20th, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division had landed on Betio Island after what commanders believed was adequate preliminary bombardment. The operation had begun at 09:10 when the first wave of amphibious tractors crossed the reef toward the beach. The naval gunfire had lasted approximately 3 hours and delivered nearly 3,000 tons of shells onto an island measuring less than half a square mile. Observers reported that the island appeared to be completely devastated. Fires burned among the shattered buildings. No movement was visible. Marine commanders expected light resistance. What they encountered was a nightmare. Japanese defenders emerged from their bunkers as the landing craft approached and opened fire with machine guns, rifles, and artillery. The Marines, many of whom had to wade hundreds of yards across the reef because their landing craft could not cross the coral barrier at low tide, were slaughtered in the water. Those who reached the beach found themselves pinned against a seawall while Japanese fire swept the landing zone. By the end of November 20th, over 1,000 Marines were dead or wounded. It took until November 23rd, 76 hours of brutal close combat, to secure an island that American planners had expected to fall in hours. The Japanese garrison of approximately 4,700 men fought virtually to the last man, with only 17 Japanese soldiers taken prisoner. The fortifications had performed exactly as designed. The fortifications on Kwajalein Island itself were substantial by Pacific standards. American intelligence estimated over 40 concrete pillboxes and blockhouses defended the island, interconnected by trenches and protected by an anti-tank ditch on the southern approach. The ditch measured approximately 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, sufficient to stop light tanks and channel heavier vehicles into prepared killing zones. Behind the ditch, a continuous rifle trench allowed defenders to shift positions without exposing themselves to fire. 4 127mm coastal defense guns covered the ocean approaches from reinforced positions at either end of the island. These guns could engage American ships at ranges of over 10 miles, though their fixed mounts limited their effectiveness against fast-moving targets. 6 80mm dual-purpose guns could engage both ships and aircraft, providing anti-aircraft defense while also serving as additional coastal artillery. Numerous smaller positions held light machine guns, heavy machine guns, and anti-tank weapons, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach to the island. The garrison numbered approximately 5,000 men, including naval infantry, army detachments, and support personnel. Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama commanded the defense as head of the 6th Base Force, with his headquarters established in a reinforced command post near the center of the island. Akiyama knew his defenses were not perfect. Construction quality varied, and many positions lacked the reinforced concrete that would have made them truly formidable. Some bunkers had been built hastily by conscript laborers rather than trained engineers. Others lacked adequate drainage and flooded during heavy rains. The supply situation was precarious, with food and ammunition limited by the long supply lines from Japan and the growing effectiveness of American submarine attacks on Japanese shipping. But Akiyama also knew that the narrow geography of Kwajalein Island worked in his favor. The island stretched 2.5 miles long, but measured only 880 yards at its widest point. There was no room for the Americans to maneuver around his defenses. They would have to advance straight down the island, bunker by bunker, position by position. Every fortification would extract its toll in American casualties before falling. This was the mathematics of attrition warfare, and Akiyama believed the numbers favored the defenders. What Akiyama did not know was that the American army had spent 2 years developing a weapon specifically designed to destroy fortifications like his. The weapon began its life not as a bunker buster, but as an anti-aircraft gun. The 3-inch gun M1918 had been developed during the First World War to engage high-altitude bombers threatening American cities and military installations. The gun was a product of American industrial engineering at its most practical. Rather than designing an entirely new weapon, Army ordnance officers had adapted an existing 3-inch naval gun for land-based anti-aircraft use, modifying the mount and recoil system while retaining the proven barrel and ammunition. The result was a weapon that could engage targets at altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet, firing a 13-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. The gun was accurate, reliable, and available in large numbers by the time the United States entered the Second World War. Thousands had been manufactured and deployed to defend American military installations, ports, and industrial facilities against the bomber threat that never materialized. Army ordnance officers recognized that the 3-inch gun's ballistic properties made it potentially useful against ground targets as well. A shell designed to punch through aircraft aluminum at maximum range would have no difficulty penetrating the armor of enemy tanks at combat distances. The velocity that allowed the shell to reach high-altitude bombers also translated into exceptional flat trajectory performance against ground targets. Unlike howitzer shells that arced high into the air before descending on their targets, the 3-inch gun fired on a nearly flat trajectory that made aiming simpler and impact more predictable. The shell would strike where the gunner aimed, rather than falling from above, at an angle that varied with range. These characteristics made the 3-inch gun attractive as an anti-tank weapon, particularly as reports from North Africa indicated that German tanks were becoming increasingly resistant to existing American anti-tank guns. The question was how to mount such a large weapon on a mobile platform that could keep pace with armored operations. The 3-inch gun weighed over 2 tons with its mounting and recoil mechanism. The barrel measured nearly 16 feet long. The ammunition was heavy enough to require a dedicated loader working continuously to maintain any reasonable rate of fire. Simply placing the gun on a truck chassis would not work because the recoil forces would tear the vehicle apart and the gun would be impossible to aim accurately from an unstable platform. A purpose-built vehicle was required, one that combined the firepower of the 3-inch gun with the mobility to operate alongside tanks and the protection to survive on a modern battlefield. The answer emerged in early 1942 when the Army began development of what would become the M10 gun motor carriage. The design team at the Aberdeen Proving Ground faced competing requirements that seemed almost impossible to reconcile. The 3-inch gun was heavy and bulky, requiring a substantial mounting to absorb its recoil forces. The turret needed to rotate a full 360 degrees to engage targets in any direction. The vehicle needed enough armor to protect its crew from small arms fire and shell fragments, but not so much armor that it became slow and unwieldy. Weight was critical, because every additional pound of armor meant reduced speed, reduced range, and increased wear on the drivetrain. The Army wanted a vehicle that could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour on roads and cross rough terrain without bogging down. The solution was to mount the gun in an open-topped turret on a modified M4 Sherman tank chassis. This approach provided the mechanical reliability of the proven Sherman drivetrain while saving the weight of a fully enclosed turret. The Sherman chassis used a vertical volute spring suspension system that handled rough terrain well and was relatively simple to maintain. The transmission provided 5 forward speeds and 1 reverse, allowing the driver to select the appropriate gear for terrain conditions. The hull was slightly modified from the standard Sherman, with thinner armor plate that reduced weight while still providing protection against machine gun fire and shell splinters. The turret was designed specifically for the 3-inch gun, with a sloped front that helped deflect incoming fire and counterweights on the rear to balance the heavy gun barrel. The open top was considered acceptable because the M10 was not intended to engage enemy tanks in close combat. Tank Destroyer doctrine called for these vehicles to operate from prepared positions, engaging targets at range where overhead protection was less critical than mobility and firepower. The M10 would find a hull-down position, engage enemy tanks as they advanced, then relocate before enemy artillery could range on its position. In this role, overhead armor was unnecessary weight that reduced the vehicle's ability to reach advantageous positions quickly. The open top actually provided advantages in certain situations, giving the commander an unobstructed view of the battlefield and allowing the crew to escape quickly if the vehicle was hit. Of course, the open top also made the vehicle vulnerable to artillery airbursts and hand grenades, problems that would become significant when M10s were used in close terrain against infantry. Production began in September 1942 at 2 facilities operated by American automotive giants. The first M10 rolled off the Fisher body assembly line on September 12, 1942, just 7 months after the prototype had been delivered for testing. The Ford Motor Company began M10A1 production in October 1942. The Fisher body division of General Motors manufactured the M10 variant, powered by a twin diesel engine, producing 375 horsepower. The Ford Motor Company produced the M10A1 variant, with a Ford GAA gasoline engine generating 450 horsepower. The 2 engines offered different advantages, with the diesel providing better fuel economy and reduced fire risk, while the gasoline engine delivered more power for faster acceleration. In practice, the differences were minor, and both variants performed similarly in combat. The vehicles rolled off production lines at a rate that would have astonished any other nation. Fisher body alone delivered over 300 M10s per month at peak production in early 1943. By the time production ended in December 1943, American factories had delivered 6,406 M10s to the Army. Each vehicle weighed approximately 29 tons and carried a crew of 5 men consisting of a commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver who also operated the hull machine gun. The main armament was the 3-inch gun M7, a refined version of the original anti-aircraft weapon adapted for ground combat use. The gun could fire 54 rounds of ammunition stored in the hull and turret, including armor-piercing rounds capable of penetrating over 4 inches of hardened steel at 1,000 yards. Against soft targets like trucks and infantry, high explosive rounds were available that functioned similarly to the 75mm ammunition used by Sherman tanks. The secondary armament consisted of a single 50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun mounted on a ring at the rear of the turret, intended primarily for anti-aircraft defense, but also useful against infantry. The turret traversed manually rather than by power, which meant rotating to engage a new target could take 30 seconds or more as the crew cranked the heavy assembly around. This was considered acceptable for a defensive weapon that would typically engage targets from prepared positions. The M10 was designed primarily for the European theatre, where American planners expected to face large numbers of German tanks. Intelligence reports from North Africa described encounters with the German Tiger tank, a massive 70-ton vehicle, mounting an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. The existing American 75mm guns could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at any practical combat range. The M10's 3-inch gun offered a solution, with sufficient penetrating power to defeat the Tiger at ranges under 1,000 yards. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with M10s would provide American armored divisions with a counter to German heavy armor, ambushing Tigers and Panthers from concealed positions and destroying them before they could close with American medium tanks. However, the Pacific theater presented different challenges. Japanese tanks were generally inferior to American vehicles, rarely requiring specialized tank destroyers to defeat them. The standard Japanese medium tank, the Type 97 Chiha, weighed only 15 tons and mounted a 47mm gun that could barely scratch the paint on an American Sherman. Even the newest Japanese designs were a generation behind German armor in protection, firepower, and mechanical reliability. American Sherman tanks could defeat any Japanese tank at ranges exceeding their own effective engagement distance. The Japanese threat came not from armor but from fortifications, and here the M10's capabilities had not been fully explored. The 3-inch gun generated significantly more kinetic energy than the 75mm gun mounted on standard Sherman tanks. A 75mm round weighed approximately 14 pounds and left the muzzle at 2,030 feet per second. The 3-inch round was only slightly lighter at 13 pounds, but achieved a muzzle velocity nearly 600 feet per second higher. This difference in velocity translated into substantially greater kinetic energy at impact. Energy increases with the square of velocity, so a relatively modest increase in muzzle velocity produced a dramatic increase in striking power. While both guns were effective against exposed infantry and light field fortifications, the 3-inch gun could defeat structures that would stop a 75mm round cold. No one knew yet whether this theoretical advantage would translate into practical effectiveness against Japanese bunkers. That experiment would be conducted at Kwajalein. The 767th Tank Battalion arrived at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii on February 8, 1943, after a voyage from the mainland that had taken over 2 weeks. Originally equipped as a light tank battalion with M3 Stuart tanks mounting 37mm guns, the unit underwent reorganization over the following months. The light tanks were replaced with M4A1 Sherman tanks mounting 75mm guns, transforming the battalion into a medium tank unit capable of supporting infantry operations against fortified positions. The reorganization was completed by September 1943. More significantly, the battalion's assault gun platoon was equipped with 5 M10 Tank Destroyers, the first such vehicles assigned to a unit in the Pacific Theater of Operations. These 5 vehicles represented an experiment, a test of whether the M10 could contribute to Pacific operations despite being designed for a completely different enemy. The battalion began intensive combined arms training with the 7th Infantry Division on November 5, 1943, preparing for the upcoming invasion of the Marshall Islands. During these exercises, the tankers and infantrymen developed tactics for combined arms operations against fortified positions. The Sherman tanks would advance with the infantry, providing suppressive fire against Japanese positions while the riflemen closed to assault range. When a bunker proved too strong for the Sherman's 75mm gun, the M10s would be called forward to engage with their heavier armament. The theory was sound, drawing on lessons learned at Tarawa about the importance of having weapons capable of defeating Japanese fortifications. No one knew yet whether the theory would work in practice. The difference between the 75mm and 3-inch guns might be significant or might be irrelevant. Only combat would provide the answer. Operation Flintlock, the invasion of Kwajalein Atoll, was planned as a twin assault designed to crack open the heart of the Japanese Marshall Islands defense. The 4th Marine Division would land on the twin islands of Roy and Namur at the northern end of the atoll, seizing a Japanese airfield that could support operations throughout the region. The 7th Infantry Division would assault Kwajalein Island at the southern end, capturing the administrative center and headquarters of the Japanese garrison. Between them, these operations would secure the largest lagoon anchorage in the Central Pacific and eliminate Japanese air and naval presence in the Marshall Islands. The lessons of Tarawa weighed heavily on American planners. The invasion force was massive. Over 85,000 men embarked on nearly 300 warships. Air support came from 6 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers embarking over 700 aircraft. Nothing would be left to chance. The preliminary strikes began on January 29, 1944, when carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 attacked Japanese installations throughout the Marshall Islands. Admiral Frederick Sherman's task group, 58.3, concentrated on Kwajalein itself, destroying 92 of the 110 Japanese aircraft that had survived previous raids. By the end of the first day, Rear Admiral Akiyama had lost his ability to mount an effective air defense. His remaining aircraft were too few and too widely scattered to challenge the American carriers. The Japanese air forces that were supposed to make the American invasion prohibitively costly had been destroyed on the ground before the first landing craft launched. This was American doctrine refined through hard experience, achieving air superiority before committing ground forces to the assault. The naval bombardment began on January 30th and continued through the landings on February 1st. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers took up positions around the atoll and began systematic destruction of visible targets. The bombardment was not random area fire but directed destruction aimed at specific fortifications identified through aerial photography and intelligence analysis. Battleship Maryland closed to within 2,000 yards of the northern beaches, so close that observers said her 16-inch guns almost poked their muzzles into Japanese positions. At that range, the massive shells struck with devastating accuracy, obliterating anything they hit directly. Admiral Turner, commanding the amphibious force, would later describe the bombardment in terms borrowed from Churchill, stating that never in the history of human conflict has so much been thrown by so many at so few. For 72 hours, the bombardment continued without respite. 15,000 tons of bombs and naval shells struck an island measuring less than 3 square miles. One American soldier would later say that the entire island looked as if it had been picked up to 20,000 feet and then dropped. British Commander Anthony Kimmins, observing the operation, described it as the most damaging bombardment he had ever witnessed. Nothing could have lived through that sea and air bombardment, he reported. The foliage that had provided concealment for Japanese positions was simply erased. Palm trees were reduced to shattered stumps. Administrative buildings collapsed into rubble. Radar installations were twisted into unrecognizable metal. The carefully maintained airfield was cratered beyond immediate use. Bodies of Japanese soldiers caught in the open littered the beaches and roads. To observers watching from the ships, it appeared that nothing on Kwajalein could have survived. And yet, beneath the devastation, the bunkers held. Their palm log walls had absorbed the blast effects exactly as designed. The near misses that constituted 90% of the bombardment had done exactly what Japanese engineers expected, which was nothing of consequence to the structures themselves. The shells had landed around the bunkers rather than on them, throwing up debris and creating craters but leaving the fortifications intact. Inside, Japanese soldiers had endured 72 hours of terror as the earth shook and dust filtered through every crack, but they had survived. Their weapons were ready. Their ammunition was dry. When the bombardment lifted and the American landing craft appeared on the horizon, they would emerge from their bunkers and fight. This was the plan, and for the first 2 days of the battle, the plan seemed to be working. The 7th Infantry Division began landing on Kwajalein Island at 09:30 on February 1st, 1944. The 32nd Infantry Regiment hit Red Beach 2, while the 184th Infantry Regiment landed on Red Beach 1. Initial resistance was lighter than expected. The bombardment had killed or stunned many of the Japanese defenders in exposed positions, and American troops pushed inland rapidly during the first hours. The eastern half of the island was secured by sunset, far ahead of the conservative schedule that planners had developed based on the Tarawa experience. but as the infantry advanced beyond the shattered beach defences and into the heart of the island, they encountered the bunker line. Here, the advance stalled. Japanese machine gunners had survived inside their palm log fortifications and now poured fire into the advancing Americans. The bunkers were almost invisible in the debris-strewn landscape, their firing slits concealed among the shattered vegetation. American infantry would advance toward what appeared to be a pile of rubble, only to receive a burst of machine gun fire from a position they had not detected. The Shermans of the 767th Tank Battalion moved forward to support the infantry, their 75mm guns engaging the bunkers at close range. The results were disappointing. Shells that would have destroyed a German armoured vehicle or reduced a brick building to rubble simply embedded themselves in the palm log walls without penetrating. The fibrous wood absorbed the impact. The sand and coral backing dissipated the blast. Japanese gunners paused momentarily when shells struck their positions, then resumed firing. The American advance ground to a halt. On February 2nd, the advance continued under a coordinated assault plan developed overnight by division staff officers. Artillery batteries on nearby Carlson Island provided fire support, while the tanks and infantry pushed toward a major defensive complex the Americans designated Cornstrong Point. This position featured an anti-tank ditch backed by reinforced bunkers and a long rifle trench that allowed defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves. The 32nd Infantry's 3rd Battalion was assigned to reduce the position, supported by tanks from A and D companies of the 767th Tank Battalion. At 1400 hours, the assault began. Medium tanks from A Company lined up along Carl Road and opened fire on the strongpoint, while B Company tanks struck from the left flank. The infantry advanced behind the armour, taking shelter in the anti-tank ditch while the tanks poured machine gun and 75mm fire into the Japanese positions. The defenders were pinned down but not destroyed. Their bunkers continued to resist direct hits from the Sherman 75mm guns. Tank commanders reported striking individual positions with multiple rounds without achieving penetration. The shells simply disappeared into the palm log walls. By nightfall, Cornstrong Point had been reduced through the costly process of demolition teams, carrying explosive charges to each bunker individually. Engineers crawled forward under covering fire, placed satchel charges against bunker walls, retreated, and detonated the explosives. This tactic worked, but it was slow, dangerous, and consumed irreplaceable trained engineers with every position reduced. An estimated 100 Japanese were killed in the area, the majority by demolition charges rather than tank fire. The Americans suffered over 60 casualties, including the loss of a company commander. If this rate of attrition continued, the battle for Kwajalein would be far costlier than planners had hoped. On the morning of February 3rd, the 5 M10 Tank Destroyers of the 767th Tank Battalion's assault platoon were finally brought ashore. They had been held in reserve during the initial assault, their specialized capabilities reserved for the most stubborn defensive positions. Now, they would be tested against the remaining Japanese bunkers. The M10s rolled off the landing craft with their 3-inch guns elevated, tracks fitted with grousers for better traction on the coral sand. Tank destroyer crews who had trained for months against targets representing German armour now faced a completely different enemy. The bunkers ahead of them looked nothing like the profile of a Tiger tank. No one knew for certain whether the 3-inch gun would prove any more effective than the 75mm weapons that had already failed. The M10s advanced alongside the Shermans, their 3-inch guns traversing to engage targets identified by the infantry. The first bunker they engaged had already resisted multiple hits from 75mm shells. Scorch marks on the palm log exterior showed where previous rounds had struck without penetrating. The M10 commander ordered his gunner to fire. The 3-inch round struck the palm log wall at over 2,600 feet per second. The additional velocity made all the difference. Where the 75mm shell had embedded and stopped, the 3-inch round punched through the palm logs, through the sand backing, and into the interior of the bunker. The Japanese machine gun fell silent. Infantry rushed forward to confirm the kill and found the bunker's interior devastated. The defenders killed by the shell that had finally breached their protection. The M10s worked their way down the island throughout February 3rd, systematically reducing bunkers that had stopped the Sherman's cold. The physics were straightforward to anyone who understood ballistics. The 3-inch gun generated approximately 20% more muzzle energy than the 75mm weapon. This translated into substantially greater penetration against the layered palm log and sand construction that characterized Japanese fortifications. A bunker that could absorb 3 or 4 hits from a Sherman might be penetrated by a single well-placed round from an M10. The time required to reduce each position dropped from hours to minutes. Infantry casualties from bunker reduction operations decreased accordingly. Engineers who had been crawling forward with satchel charges under fire could now call for M10 support and watch as the bunkers were destroyed from safe distances. The Japanese defenders found themselves facing a weapon against which their carefully engineered defenses provided no protection. Positions that should have held for days fell in hours. The bunker that had protected the Japanese naval infantryman who opened this account was engaged by an M10 at approximately 1000 hours on February 3rd. He had survived 72 hours of bombardment. He had survived the initial infantry assault. He had survived multiple Sherman attacks. His bunker had performed exactly as designed, absorbing tremendous punishment while still allowing his crew to engage the enemy. Then the 3-inch round came through the wall. The palm logs that had stopped everything else offered no resistance to the higher velocity shell. The round detonated inside the bunker. There were no survivors. This scene repeated itself across Kwajalein Island throughout February 3rd and 4th. Position after position that had resisted conventional attack fell to the M10s. By the end of February 4th, Kwajalein Island was declared secure. Of the approximately 5,000 Japanese defenders, only 265 survived to be taken prisoner. The rest had died in their bunkers, in their trenches, or in desperate counterattacks against American positions. American casualties totaled 177 killed and approximately 1,000 wounded, a fraction of the losses suffered at Tarawa 2 months earlier. The contrast was stark. At Tarawa, over 1,000 Marines had died taking a smaller island with comparable defences. At Kwajalein, the army had suffered 1/6 the fatalities, while capturing a larger and more heavily fortified objective. Multiple factors contributed to this improvement, including better preliminary bombardment, more effective coordination between arms, and the experience gained from previous operations. But the M10s had solved a specific problem that no other weapon in the Pacific could address. They had rendered the Japanese palm log bunker obsolete. The strategic implications extended far beyond Kwajalein. Japanese defensive doctrine throughout the Pacific relied on fortifications similar to those on Kwajalein. Every island garrison had been trained to build bunkers using available materials, primarily palm logs and coral. Every defensive plan assumed these bunkers would survive preliminary bombardment and remain operational when American troops landed. The M10 changed that calculation. Now American forces possessed a weapon that could defeat Japanese bunkers at ranges beyond effective Japanese response. The defenders could not stop an M10 with rifle fire or light machine guns. They could not disable it with grenades, as they could infantry demolition teams. They could only watch as the vehicle approached to within a few hundred yards and put a 3-inch round through their protective walls. Japanese commanders learned of the new American weapon through prisoner interrogations and after-action analysis. The reports that reached Tokyo described a tank-like vehicle mounting a gun of exceptional power, capable of destroying bunkers that had resisted all other weapons. Defensive planners began reassessing their fortification designs. The palm log bunker that had been standard throughout the Pacific would need to be redesigned or replaced. Thicker walls would be required, or different construction materials, or deeper underground positions where the terrain permitted. These changes would take time and resources that Japan did not have. The American advance was accelerating, and each island would be attacked before its defenses could be significantly improved. The production statistics told their own story of American industrial dominance. 6,410 M10s had been manufactured in just 15 months. More tank destroyers than Japan produced tanks during the entire war. Each M10 carried a gun that could defeat any Japanese fortification and penetrate any Japanese tank at standard combat ranges. When an M10 was damaged or destroyed, another was available to replace it. When ammunition was expended, more could be landed from the seemingly infinite American supply chain. The Japanese had no equivalent weapon and no industrial capacity to develop one. They could only watch as American forces refined their tactics and brought ever more effective weapons to bear against their island defenses. The war had entered a phase where Japanese courage and determination could not compensate for American material superiority. The men of the 767th Tank Battalion completed their operations at Kwajalein on February 7th, when they re-embarked for the return to Hawaii. They had proven the value of the M10 in the Pacific theater, demonstrating that the vehicle designed to kill German tanks could also kill Japanese bunkers. The 5 M10s of the assault platoon had participated in the reduction of numerous fortified positions, providing direct fire support that complemented the Sherman tanks and infantry demolition teams. Later that year, the battalion would land at Leyte in the Philippines, continuing to support the 7th Infantry Division as American forces began the liberation of the Philippine Islands. The M10s and their successors would see service throughout the remaining Pacific campaigns, providing the heavy direct fire capability that palm log bunkers could not resist. Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama did not survive to analyze the failure of his defenses. He was killed during the fighting on Kwajalein Island, probably on February 3rd or 4th when American forces overran his command post. His final hours were spent in a bunker that his engineers had assured him would survive American bombardment, only to discover that a weapon he had never anticipated could tear through walls that should have been impenetrable. He was one of approximately 4,700 Japanese who died defending Kwajalein Atoll. Their fortifications had been well designed, according to the best available doctrine. Their troops had fought with characteristic determination. They had simply encountered an enemy who possessed both the industrial capacity to develop specialized weapons and the tactical flexibility to deploy them effectively. Against such an enemy, courage and good engineering were not enough. The captured Type 89B tank from the Japanese 7th Independent Tank Company sits today in storage at the Army's museum facility in Alabama, a rusting reminder of a conflict that ended 8 decades ago. The M10s that helped capture Kwajalein are gone, scrapped after the war, along with most American military equipment of that era. What remains is the historical record, documenting the moment when American industrial power and Japanese defensive doctrine collided on a small coral island in the Central Pacific. The outcome was never truly in doubt. The Americans had the weapons, the men, and the material to win. The M10 Tank Destroyer was simply one more example of a nation that could identify a problem, engineer a solution, and manufacture that solution by the thousands while their enemies struggled to understand what had hit them. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories from the Second World War. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.